Hello. Welcome to Past and Present with Allison Gilbert and guests. My name is Andrew Engel. I'm senior programmer at Reimagine. Our mission at Reimagine is to help people of all backgrounds face adversity, loss, and mortality, and channel the hard parts of life into meaningful action and growth. Allison will introduce our guest, Victoria Chang, who has been a featured speaker at not one, but two Reimagine Vigils. And now I'm going to hand this over to Allison for a few words.
I am so grateful to be here again today. Thank you so much, Andy and Reimagine, of course. And we all wouldn't be here without For Grief. And so I thank For Grief so much for their financial leadership, their financial backing. So gratitude. A couple of housekeeping things before we dig in this month. Number one, we are very good on time here during the Past and Present series. We are starting at 1 o'clock Eastern. We will be done at the strike of 2 o'clock Eastern. The reason why I'm sharing that with you is so you know that we are going to honor your time. And I also want you to take advantage of this time. I don't want you to think that, oh, I'll wait till, 2:05 Eastern and I'll get my question into Victoria. It is rare. I know she has been a part of the Reimagine family before, but she is now here to take your questions in the chat. You are here for a reason, so please take advantage of it. My worst fear is that we are done at the strike of 2 o'clock Eastern and you'll say, I wish I would have asked Victoria this burning question I have. Don't do that. To that point, on this call, as she always is Christina Serio. Raise your hand. Yes, she will be going through the chat throughout our conversation. If you have questions, if you have comments, that is the place for you to put it. What we will do at about the halfway mark is that I will turn the baton over to Christina and I'll ask her to go through the chat questions to ask Victoria what is really on your mind and what brought you here today. So with that said, I have to admit that I am a fan girl of Victoria's. Huge. And in fact, I didn't even know what Andy had said, that she was a past Reimagine guest. I had no idea. I book these events myself. And so, wow, Victoria, your fandom here at Reimagine is real. So my first thing I want to say is welcome.
Thank you so much. I'm excited to chat with you.
And as I was prepping this morning, you actually had some breaking news on Twitter. I couldn't believe my eyes as I was scrolling through, but you're actually stepping down as poetry editor of the New York Times, and you just posted that on Twitter today.
Yeah, it's a year-long appointment. And so I started January 1st of last year, and they stretched me out a little bit through the month of January in order to get the new editor kind of prepped and ready to go. And so today I posted my very last poem, which was a poem by the poet Adam Wolfond. And he's a non-speaking autistic poet, and I was really excited to be able to feature his poem. And we worked really hard to get, he has these really interesting blue lines that run through the book. And one of the words is blue and also kind of circled by that. And so it was a lot of work on the New York Times editors to kind of get that formatting right, because we have such space problems. And so it's really hard to get formatting right. And so I was really excited to be able to feature that poem in my last pick.
So I'm a journalist, and I have to ask you, because you are here who is going to be the next editor, the poetry editor for the New York Times?
I know who it is, and I don't know the person personally, but I'm not allowed to say anything. But I think it'll be really cool to have this person selecting poems, and I look forward to seeing what this person picks.
All right. Well, I tried. I
Nice
tried
try.
to get it out of you. The other piece of housekeeping I will just say, just in case, before I really dig in, is that I've been suffering a bit of a cold. I have my hot water next to me and some cough drops, but if I start coughing wildly, I will mute my mic and I will ask Victoria to, keep going without me until I regain my composure. But Victoria, you are a poet, you are a writer, an editor, a critic. As of today, I guess you are still poetry editor of the New York Times until the baton officially passes. What drew you to that role? Before we dig into other questions that I have, what was that platform like for you to elevate the work of poets? That must have been an incredible, difficult task, but also an incredibly uplifting one as well. What was it like?
It's hard. I mean, I only had, like 50 slots or so, and we have space constraints, 30 or fewer lines, and not a lot of, really, you can't have a lot of, different kind of formatting in there. And, I had 7 years of editors before me, and was really wanting to do something different. So it was difficult. I tried to pick poets and poems, but definitely poets that had never been published in the New York Times before. So that required me to do some tracking and figure out what had been published in the past. And so I was really committed to that. And also publishing poems in translation is something that new that I did, and just sort of diversifying the repertoire of poets and poems and publishers that I think the New York Times have that they published in the past. And so given all of those constraints, I think it really enriched my own reading for the last year and gave me the opportunity to seek out poets and poems and publishers that I would have never thought of myself. And so I think it was a lot more work than I think I needed to make it, but I was really committed to sticking to some of the principles that I set out for myself at the beginning. And it was a very much more public role than I was wanting, if that makes sense. Like I don't really like to be out in the world. I like to sort of just write my poems and then kind of hide a little bit. So it gave me a lot of anxiety, to be honest. You're always afraid, that something is going to go wrong, or you're going to pick something that other people don't like, or something's going to happen. And so I'm kind of glad to pass it on for all of those reasons. But I really feel proud of the work that I did over the past year.
Well, I have been a joyful consumer of what you have done, so my thanks to you. It's interesting that you talk about wanting to hide in your words and write your own poetry as opposed to this public-facing role, but I will talk now that you're in LA and you are a core faculty member. Do I pronounce it Antioch? It's the Antioch Low Residency MFA program. So you do teach. And so I'm wondering what you see in your students. What are those qualities that you are trying to nurture if we were in your classroom?
Yeah. So, just stretching. So I like to meet students where they're at in terms of their writing. So everybody is so different, like every single person I'm looking at right now is so different from the next person. And so for me as a teacher, I'm trying to figure out what this person's like, what, where their sort of core soul is, if that makes sense. And then trying to figure out what they're trying to do in their writing, meeting them where they are, yet really trying to stretch them into different places. And obviously I've read a ton of stuff and, and so I try and bring in new reading and really push people on craft and also just their reading. But it's a lot of, I think a lot of writing is work on the self. I think it's just the process of trying to understand why we're here, what we're doing, who we are. And I think there's a lot of self-work that needs to be done when we're writing as well. And a lot of people, when they're writing, I think, forget that they're actually making something. So they're very interested in getting their thoughts or ideas onto paper, but then they forget, oh, wait, I'm actually sculpting something, like I'm making a piece of art. And so I have to remind the students that they're actually doing that too, and not just sort of journaling, which is different than making a piece of art. So yeah, I mean, I really enjoy teaching. It's a different part of my brain, but it's, I enjoy kind of hanging out with people and getting to know them.
I'm curious, for those of us who are on this call who are not as familiar with MFA programs, as I'm sure, of course, you are. Yours is a low residency program. Describe how that is distinct from other residency programs, and who would then qualify for being in this orbit? Like, what preparations do you need to be in a low residency program?
Yeah, a low residency program is for people who don't want to move or might have a job. Like I did a low residency MFA program. So I had a job that I, really wanted to keep and didn't want to, move to Houston or wherever else I was thinking about going, and stop my life for 2 years. So low residency program is it's a lot of remote work. And so you meet twice a year for 10 days, once in June and one in December. And I used to be the program chair. We just changed everything to be hybrid. So people can even do it all online. And you can go there for 10 days and really intense, like just think of like a massive conference with seminars and all sorts of things, workshops. And then you get matched with a mentor, like a faculty mentor, and then you go work with them online for the next 5 months. And there's a lot of programming in between, obviously, but it's really flexible. And for me, that's the only reason why I'm here today, because I don't think that I would have gone back to go and get a master's in fine arts and creative writing. It's like I'm an immigrant's kid. It's just didn't make sense to me. But I think that MFA low res allowed me to fit it into my working life and my idea of myself, if that makes sense, my identity. And then because of that, I realized that I had a lot to learn in terms of writing, and that was a big hinge point in my writing life that I didn't realize at the time.
Well, let's get into your identity. Some of it is just biographical, that I do want to get into your writing, but your credentials are extraordinary. You've received a Guggenheim Fellowship, of course. I'm going to pick up this piece of paper so I can read it so I don't mess up any of your accolades. Your latest book that came out last year is called The Trees Witness Everything, and it was named one of the best books of the year by The New Yorker and The Guardian. Not too shabby. Tell us about The Trees Witness Everything.
Yeah, that was a book of, I call them miniature poems that I wrote. So, it actually came out of just watching people post little miniature poems on social media and thinking, wow, those are hard to write. And so I wanted to see if I could try writing them, just because I was in the mode of having written my book Obit, which was hard to write, and then another book, Dear Memory, which is a book of epistolary, letter essays and collage and photographs and things like that. And so I was just trying to exercise the brain and the creative muscles, and gave myself a little assignment to write these little poems that are all in syllable form. So they're, think of like a haiku, which is 5-7-5. I think everyone knows that, but these are, different kinds of syllabic forms that I found when I was doing research, like 5-7-5, 7-7-7, like they all have different names. And so giving myself those syllabic constraints was just something fun to do because I felt like form could, for me at least, opens up more possibilities than it restricts.
I want to dig into this a little bit further because the first thing that you said is that what you were seeing on social media inspired this process for you. So my first question is, what social media channels were you on specifically? Were they poetry sites or poetry channels that we in turn should follow? Are these places that you go for inspiration?
Yeah, I mean, I guess maybe I was thinking about Instagram, like the bite-sized poems that people post on Instagram, and also thinking back to the tradition of the haiku. And Robert Hass has this great book that he edited, all on haikus that are translated, obviously, of the sort of famous old classic haiku poets like Busan and Isa. And so I just think they're hard to write. And I think people could think possibly that short poems are easier than long poems. I think it's all difficult. It's all challenging. And so I would see, these small poems and think that I mostly write, poems that are longer. And so for me, I thought it would be fun to try. But yeah, I think they're all over social media. They're everywhere because they fit the venue, the space. And so
It's
I
so
think,
funny. And I'm just going to interrupt because maybe I speak for many people who are on this call. Maybe I don't follow the same channels you do on Instagram because I don't see what you're describing. So are there particular handles that we should be following?
I don't know. Like, I think weight of my living is something I've seen. Yeah, there are a couple on social media that are really active in posting short poems. Yeah.
Well, maybe, so I don't put you on the spot. Maybe
No, I can
we
look.
always send out a thank you email to recap and to send out the link to this entire conversation to everyone who has registered. Maybe if you think of others, I can put that in the thank you email. And so folks can go follow those accounts if they are so inclined. I'm just curious because I don't know what they are either. So that would be really fun and helpful, I think.
Yeah, I mean, the only reason why I know it is because they might post a poem of mine and they tag me, and that's how I learn about them. But Lit Bowl is another one. I mean, some of these Instagram sites, they have like 50,000 or hundreds of thousands. Like, people are really interested in getting a little bit of bite-sized poetry in their day. So sometimes they just post poems and they'll tag me, and I'll look and I think, wow, there are a lot of people following these sites, and it gives me hope that people are interested in reading poetry.
Well, people are definitely interested in following you on social media. You have more than 27,000 followers on Twitter. If everyone wants to follow Victoria, it's The Chang Poet on Twitter. On Instagram, you can explain it if you want. It's Fattery12, Fatter 12. And then on Facebook, it's Victoria.Chang7169. So please do allow your social media to be full of Victoria's amazing work. So let's go into, you mentioned your work, Dear Memory. And there was a glorious profile of you in the New Yorker. And I want to just read something that I found really compelling in that New Yorker profile of you, with your dogs, by the way, who are adorable. This is what the New Yorker profile said in part. Chang resists conventional eulogy, writing not only about the dead, but to them. Help us understand that.
Yeah, Dear Memory, the the book was, so my mother passed away from pulmonary fibrosis and she died in 2015, but it's a pretty long, it can be a long illness. And what happens is your lungs sort of harden and then you gradually, in some cases, very gradually suffocate to death. And she got worse when my dad had a stroke, maybe 15 or so years ago. And he has also since passed away last year. And so for me, once my mother passed away, and that traumatized me. I was thinking about this morning in that I was struck by grief, and I couldn't believe how difficult it was, and all the, because I'm at a different space in my life, and my father, everybody's different. So my relationship with my father, my relationship with my father's illness, and him as a person, it's different. And then, but my mother, that was the first really large blow. I used the sort of violent language because that's what it felt to me. I was shocked by my mother's passing. But when she had died, after she died, had written this book, Obit, that really kind of grappled with that grief. I started just digging into boxes. It's a long process of cleaning out someone's life. And she was such a hoarder, God bless her, and collector of things. And it was to me, it's a manifestation of a form of anxiety she really had. So it took me forever. And still this year, I was also cleaning out all these extra, there are just so many boxes everywhere. And in this box, these 2 boxes, I found all these interesting documents. And, I discovered that her name was like slightly different. Her birth dates were kind of wonky. She had all these really, I finally knew the name of my grandmother, the birth cities, it's like all this stuff that I just didn't know because she's, came from 2 different countries and didn't really, talk about trauma and stuff like that. So I started writing her letters, and I wrote her a letter. So it was Dear Mother. And I just kept on going and ended up with this book, Dear Memory. So to me, yeah, there are different phases of grief. And that was sort of a different phase than writing these poems for her, or maybe even maybe just for myself, to be honest, for in Obit. So asking, for Dear Memory was asking her all these questions that I just really wanted to ask her, but I knew I couldn't get the answers to. But it was comforting to me to actually go through that process myself.
What I find so instructive and helpful and teachable about that work, about Dear Memory, is that many people who grapple with loss don't have access to family history. Stories may not be readily available. Photographs, you're talking about having a lot of material to go through. Some people feel like they don't have enough to even reconstruct a family or a loved one's story. And so I love the fact that you wrestle with that. In fact, the mystery of our loved ones. And the New Yorker went on to say, and I'm going to read it again. Maybe I'll get out my glasses. It's slightly a little bit longer. So give me 1 second. It says, even the most basic facts about Chang's family's past remain a mystery to her. It is only by sorting through old documents, as you have just said, that she learns her mother's birthday, her father's rarely used American name. This is the point. These are details of lives that cannot be straightforwardly commemorated through eulogy or captured through obituary. It's been a while since the New Yorker wrote that profile. How does that land to you as a reflection of your work?
Yeah, I thought that was really beautifully written. The whole article is really beautifully written. And I think you're right. I think we all have those. I mean, we're all individually sort of mysteries. And gosh, I mean, I'm a mystery to myself. I don't even understand what happens within this own vessel that I was given. And it's impossible. What I realized is that, kind of reading from Dear Memory or Obit, but especially Dear Memory, how many people would tell me or come up to me and say that that book kind of, as writers, it really inspired them to kind of work on their own stories. And it occurred to me throughout that process when that book first came out is that we all actually have these relationships with people that remain various degrees of mysterious to us. And it doesn't even matter how close we were to them, because I was quite close to my mother, but what is closeness? I mean, closeness is not the equivalent of knowledge, and how much we just leave on the table and take for granted things when they're alive. And then, I'm also very curious. So it's not that I didn't ask questions, but even if I did ask questions, they certainly weren't all the questions that I wanted to know. And when I did ask her one time to do an interview a long time ago, it's almost like I had foreshadowed and anticipated all of this. She didn't remember a lot either. So she left, China when she was 7, 8, who knows? I don't think she knows or knew. And that was a period of war and time of war. And the memories for her were really fuzzy too. And I just always think about like how much is lost from generation to generation. And it makes me so sad to think about that. And so how do we grapple with those fragments that we all have, and how do we make sense of them, and how do they relate to our own selves and identities, and how do they relate to our grief? Those are all really interesting questions to me. And yeah, I found this in the process of doing research. I learned a lot about memory and people that have been studying memory for a long time. And there's this great book called, I think, Memory and Migration. It's an anthology of essays that people had written. And I learned, all sorts of things about memory related to immigrants that I didn't know before, but there are academics that study this work. And so it was a really useful process for me to see what, scholars and other people had written about memory and immigrants and people who had experienced trauma, and how that trauma is just passed on through my mother to her, to, me, because that's through like every little tiny thing, like how she raised us. I just find that to be so fascinating. And when you're a child, you don't know you're experiencing all of these things.
In a very like practical way, you're talking about, pulling back the camera lens and seeing something more broadly. But if folks who are listening want to have practical ways of keeping memories alive, how to sort through photographs, what to do with documents, if there's lots of clothing left behind, how to remember through the 5 senses, how you can use your hearing and your taste and your smell to honor loved ones or ancestors. That is why this series is called Past and Present. It's based off of my book, Past and Present, like passed away, keeping memories of loved ones alive. These are topics that For Grief talks a lot about on its platform and on its social media. So if that topic is of interest, I live it, I breathe it, I love talking about it. I've also lost both of my parents, Victoria, and that's where that book came from, because I wanted to not only remember my mom and dad for me, but I wanted to keep my parents' memories alive for my children who never got to know their maternal grandparents. And so I love what you're saying. And now that we're at 1:31 Eastern time, I do want to make sure we have time to talk about your book, Obit. this is where I want to spend some time before we take questions. I have obit right here, and if you guys can see it, maybe you can't really see it very well. You can see in a very eerie way, Victoria, at least 4 different times in obit, you wrote your own obit in a way.
Yeah.
Explain.
Yeah, so these poems are sort of strange poems that are in the shape of obituaries. And yeah, I didn't really want to write the traditional elegy. I always say this, but everyone else had done it better, and I wasn't really interested. And who wants to write about their dead mother? I certainly did not, because I felt like every time I think about it or look at a photo or start writing, it's like I'm sort of re-traumatizing myself and start, crying. And I didn't want to do that. But then I heard on NPR, they're talking about this documentary on it's on the obituary writer. It's called Obit. And I don't know, something about that moment sort of gave me the inspiration to sort of look at how everything dies when someone dies, and tiny little things did, especially in a longer illness, so all the poems are like ambition, tears, my mother's teeth, my mother's lungs, civility, everything dies, the future. And I know I wrote a whole bunch that Victoria Chang died on blank blank, because I don't know, I feel like something I realized when my mother died is that, like everything that we had together, our own unique experience in history also died. And in many ways that that Victoria Chang died. And so that's sort of an explanation of how those individual Victoria Chang poems came.
I want you to pause just so everyone can hear that the structure that you came up with for obit, it worked. It's an exceptional collection. It was named a New York Times notable book. It was a Time must read book. It received the Los Angeles Times Book Prize. It received the PEN Volcker Award. It was long listed for the National Book Award and named, if that's not enough, it was named a finalist for the National Book Critic Circles Award. It is incredible. I have it here. And I just want to make sure that we are really getting the point across about what you did that's so creative. So here's the first one, and they're really written like obits, right? That little long kind of column. They're literally written as if you would see it as an obit in the paper. So like as an example, let me grab my glasses again so I don't mince any of Victoria's beautiful words. My father's frontal lobe died unpeacefully of a stroke on June 24th, 2009. I'm just going to fast forward. Language died brilliant and beautiful on August 1st, 2009 at 2:46 p.m. Lover of raising his hand, language lived a full life of questioning. Just do 2 more. The future died on June 24th, 2009. In another obit, civility died on June 24th, 2009. So you guys get the picture that every obit is a part of your grief and loss experience. And it just made me remember little things about my parents' illnesses that I hadn't thought of in so long. And to me, that is a window into remarkable writing. And I wonder, when you look back at obit, how does your own writing land for you? Does it bring you back to that very specific time in your life?
Yeah, I think I just think back on how devastated I was, and I want to tell my devastated self that things do change. And at the time, I just didn't think that I would ever feel any different or any better. But I don't like to use that word because it's not really better. I just feel different. It's a different kind of grief. It doesn't really leave, but it's it's not all consuming and all encompassing in ways that it was. And it's not so confusing anymore. Like, I still remember, like, you're supposed to do a lot in the days after someone dies. That's that's a horror within itself. You're supposed to plan this funeral. You're required in this culture, at least, to just work like a dog, which it's a strange phrase because my dogs don't do any labor. They're two wiener dogs. So lazy. But yeah, no, I mean, you work so hard, and then it's really hard, and then yet you're processing or trying to process these emotions that are so ridiculously unprocessable. And those were some really difficult times, and grief just keeps going. But now, it's 2015, it's like 2023, and my father passed away last year. Different kind of passing. It's different. I feel like I would tell myself, that younger self, that it's okay. It's just a process. This is the process of living, and the cycle of living and dying. And this is what you were given as a fate in terms of their particular situations, and you did the best that you could. But it will, like, I would have told myself, it will change and it will improve. And I really feel that way today, just even talking about it. And it is re-traumatizing, like when I kind of open the book and read them, but I don't feel those intense emotions that I did as much in the past. And I think that shows development and growth and change that just happens. And so I think trusting that will happen is something that I've learned over time.
Well, speaking of time, I want to make sure that there is ample time for everyone who is here, who has a question about writing, about poetry, about getting their writing or poetry published. I think there is no one better equipped to answer those questions than you, Victoria. So I'm going to ask Christina to come back on. And while she is coming back on, I want to make sure that I go over where folks can find you when we turn off the cameras in 20 minutes or so. I am good on time, like I promised. So I want you guys to have this information before we go. I don't want to forget. So on Twitter, The Chang Poet. On Instagram, Fattery12. On Facebook, Victoria.Chang.7169. And For Grief is on Facebook. For Grief is on Instagram. And of course, there's For Grief, their website too. And if you're so inclined, you can always follow me as well. I'm at A Gilbert Writer everywhere. So Christina, please let us know what is on everyone's mind for our esteemed guests, which I'm still so giddy that I get to talk to Victoria Chang. What does everyone want to talk about?
Our first question is from Judy. She asks, how does your state of motherlessness affect your parenting?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, that's a strange thing, I find. And thanks, Judy, and thank you for the work you do as a life doula. That must be interesting and challenging at the same time. A lot of pain and humor, and I love how you describe the maze that is grief. It's what it feels like, a very tangled kind of maze. My mother and father were ill when I was just a little bit younger, I think, than maybe the average person. There are obviously so many people that have lost parents when they were younger, and that's a whole different level of challenge and difficulty. But I was in my 30s when my dad had a stroke, and my mother had pulmonary fibrosis when I was in my 30s as well, but it wasn't that pronounced. And so raising two little small children, babies at that point, toddlers, and then having to sort of grapple with end of life, like I wasn't really prepared for that simultaneous collision of unfortunate events, because I didn't enjoy those baby years like some people do. I enjoyed the much, much older when you can actually have a conversation with children. But some people love those baby phases. I did not. And so it was difficult for me to try and do all of that and figure out how it just feel, and I don't know, I feel this now today, like with all of the apocalypse and the apocalyptic news and the cycle of information that comes at us. Like, how do you live a fulfilling life and have hope for the future when everyone's telling you that everything's going to be dead soon, kind of thing? I find difficulty with that. And it makes me wonder, like, what am I supposed to be doing with myself? And that's kind of what I felt at that time too, in that it was hard to raise people and then help people die. And now raising, older children, I feel like it's hard to raise them in a world that feels so apocalyptic. So how do you not, project your own despair onto young people? That's my new challenge.
I think there's so much to unpack in what you have just said. One of my books is called Parentless Parents. And it's because I raised my two kids without my mom and dad.
Mhm.
And the emotions that raised may not be obvious. Yes, of course, there was sadness. But for me, the balance of power in my marriage was upended because my husband's parents, thankfully, were alive.
Mm.
And so all the traditions from that side of the family, all the time, really seemed to crowd out any sort of influence that I could make for my maternal, for their maternal grandparents, to make sure they knew who they were. And so, yes, there is sadness, but there's also power plays in families, and there's also anger and resentment and jealousy of those parents who still have their moms and dads to come to, let's say, school events. So I understand what you're saying for sure. So Christina, what is the next question?
I love that, by the way. Thank you for sharing that. That is a lot. And yeah, I understand everything that you were saying. And yeah, because your experience would be speculative. It's like, oh, grandma, or whatever you would call her, would have, or past tense, did or used to, or said this. And so it's just not quite as powerful as the grandma that comes over and says that or does that. And so it is, yeah, you're constantly living in the land of the past and the speculative. It's a strange place to live. And then everyone else, most of the other kids do have grandparents. But I think it did make me feel more empathy to other people who don't have certain things. And you look around and people don't have everything. Like we can't all have everything that everyone else has. And so it gave me a lot of empathy to understanding those kinds of feelings. And I always say we got a special card, like you get a special card, membership card when your one parent dies, if you have one, parents at all. And then you get another special card when your second parent dies, if you did indeed have parents. And so this, these are not cards that you necessarily want, but you do join a special cohort of people who now understand how you feel, and you understand how they feel in some ways too.
Yes. Christina.
Next, we have an anonymous question that says, what advice do you have for someone who's scared to share grief poetry because of fear it's too intense? For me, the anger stage of anger feels so shameful that I have poems about it, and I'm hesitant to share them.
Yeah, that's really a complicated relationship that you talk about, because just because someone has passed, it doesn't mean the anger goes with it. It's still here. And I think in some cases the anger is sort of magnified when someone dies, because there's no one or way to kind of deal with it anymore, because the person is gone. So, but your anger toward them, or frustration, or whatever emotions that one might feel, is still here. And I think writing is different than sharing. So I always tell my students to write unfiltered. and just assume that no one's going to read it, and just and don't be your own critic either, and correct yourself. Or I don't want to write, I feel shame. I mean, I'm like walking, a trunk of shame. It's like the first emotion I always feel is shame. And so that's my own issue. But I think that a lot of us do feel shame to some extent here and there. And I always tell like students or people that are writing is like, just don't be your own editor and don't filter yourself to write. I mean, that's the most free, honest, authentic space that we have left. And so if we start, kind of editing ourselves, boy, that's just, then why write at all? And so I think that's different than sharing. And you don't have to share anything ever. That's the beauty of it. And you can also write, like some of us are so obsessive, right, toward or around the same subject matter in 8 different ways until we kind of find something that we might want to share. So I think also the other thing you could do is send it to some writing friends or non-writing friends and ask them what they think. And that's a step, and I'll do that sometimes when I submit, talked about publishing. Sometimes I'll send a few poems to a few kind of trusty places, just kind of like to get myself more comfortable with sending certain poems out. So for me, those are smaller journals and things that like I know that people aren't going to read as much. So I purposely send to like really tiny journals that I like the editors there to kind of dip my toe into being too revealing, because it is embarrassing sometimes, the things that we write. And so yeah, that's what I would say.
I would just add that there is benefit, and I wonder if you would agree, Victoria, of writing and tossing. There's nothing that says that you have to write and have it be a permanent record. You can write, have that experience, allow that to be cathartic, and then throw it away. I wonder if you think there is truth in that. Not everything always has to be destined for an audience, even of yourself tomorrow, right? It could just be for yourself today.
Absolutely. I mean, 150% agree with you. I think writing, for me at least, is a process. It's no different than, drinking a glass of water or breathing in air or waking up in the morning. And it keeps me alive, to be totally frank. I don't know what I would do without it. And it hasn't always been that way, but certainly it was in, since I would say like maybe 10 years ago, 15 years ago. And so I think in the land of writing, the sort of capitalistic structures of writing, I think it's too, there's a lot of emphasis on the product of writing, like releasing it into the world and things like that. But for me, I don't really think like that. To me, writing is a daily, right? If we can, a practice. It's no different than meditating or working out or walking or whatever it is that people like to do, eating. Yeah, I like to eat.
Yes. All right. Thank you for that. Eating chocolate cake. I don't know. That's what my plan is. No, I'm kidding. Christina.
So we have a big fan of yours in here. Brittany is a current PhD student in poetry and says Obit has been so instrumental to her work. So she asks, she says, I'm hoping you could speak about how different forms can extend to the possibilities of elegy. How can form be used to help rectify or reimagine the lives of those we've lost, to provide them a sense of agency or even joy they may not have been able to experience in life?
Yeah, I mean, I think form for me is a way to like keep and I always use bowling. I don't know why, because I don't even bowl, but the things, the rails that they put up for kids, it allows you to get a strike. I always think that's so interesting. I think of form for me is that kind of ability to have something to do besides staring at a totally blank page. And something like form could be as simple as writing "Dear Mother," comma, and suddenly you have some anchor or something to hold on to. And then you could, like, there are thousands of forms. Like, then you can say, I'm going to tell you about a book I read recently. I just read, it's like, it just suddenly gives you the ability to open up imagination. And when you're writing about it to your mother, you might end up writing to somebody else that you really need to write to or talk about. And in talking about the book that you just read to your mother, you might actually suddenly your mind goes to something in that book that actually opens up something for yourself. So I think form is all powerful. It's a way to correspond with the world in a way that can be much better than staring at a blank page. And I think, like, conversation is that way too. It's like, thinking of things that can trigger other things that make the conversation with people more interesting too. So, yeah, I definitely think form is very powerful, and can then, to your second part of the question, it can make the person or something that you're writing about come alive in really interesting, creative ways.
In our 8 minutes that we have left, I want to remind folks that this is your chance. Please do not hesitate a second longer. Put your questions in the chat while I ask Victoria really my last prepared question. So I'm giving you a little bit of a moment to get in your last questions. But you have a forthcoming book that's expected to be published in 2024. It's called With My Back to the World. What can we expect?
Yeah, that's a book of ekphrastic poems, and I'll type it in here just in case.
Yeah, what does that mean, please?
Yeah, it's just poetry that's in correspondence with any kind of artwork. And so there's a huge tradition of ekphrastic poetry in history. And yeah, I'm corresponding with the paintings or the artwork of Agnes Martin. And so she's this really cool artist that passed. But if you don't know Agnes's work, it's really beautiful. It's very grid-like, and yeah, there's something that just resonated with me when the MoMA in New York asked me to write a poem on any piece of artwork in their entire collection. So I just couldn't. That's too much for me. I need more curation. So I just started thinking about the artist that I liked, and that she came up, and then I just kept on writing. And so now it's like a whole book that grapples with mental health, other sort of things. It's coming out in 2024. I'm really excited about it.
Well, that sounds fascinating. I never heard of that type of poetry. Maybe I'm the only one on this call that hasn't. So I feel like I've gotten smarter already. So thank you for that. Christina, 6 minutes. Let's get as many questions as we can in.
Great. Andrea asks, how can a writer tell the immigrant story in a way that non-immigrants appreciate the experience of immigrants?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I think that I think you just write your own story, and think about art and what's important to you. And I think thinking about the reader and their appreciation is probably a lost cause. It's impossible to estimate what someone's going to read and how they're going to read it. So I think it's more important to focus on your own self, and then the readers, some will resonate with your work and some won't, and you can't predict any of that, and take it personally or not. We just all do the best we can.
Christina.
Okay, next question. I wonder if there was an experience of grief that you were afraid or hesitant to write about, and yet might have also felt it was necessary.
All of it, especially, going back to the earlier questions, when you feel like you're betraying your parents in some ways, and they're not even around anymore. And but that's actually when you can be free and write whatever you want, actually. So, but all relationships are, at least in my experience, like very complex and complicated. So there are things about my mother that were challenging, and things about our relationships that was challenging. My father was challenging when he had a stroke. He lost all his language, and then it got worse and worse. He fell about 1 billion times, and his personality was so strong that he was very stubborn and continued to do things that he didn't need to or shouldn't have, and then fell again. And so at some point many points I wanted to strangle him. I was so angry at him. And so I think those are things that were hard to write about, and you feel like you are betraying them, but that's the real experience. I mean, if anyone who's gone through this, everyone has their own unique experience, but I wanted to be honest. And so for myself more than anybody else.
I would add just 2 thoughts that bubbled up while you were talking, is that I had that experience too when I was writing Parentless Parents. We were talking before about the tension between my husband and me when it came to my in-laws and their presence and the absence of my parents. And there were some experiences that I wanted to write about in terms of the creep that I felt with my mother-in-law trying to really be a wonderful grandma. But at that point, it was really uncomfortable for me. And it really was my truth. And so the only way around that to me was to, at my choosing, make her aware of what I was writing, not for editing privileges, but out of courtesy to let her know what was coming. And so I think because we were able to talk about my feelings, and it wasn't really an indictment of her, it was just my inability to process my grief and her presence at the same time, that I really felt, I felt good, or as good as I could be, to publish a book that might have been hurtful and would have been more hurtful for sure if I didn't use the experience to make sure we had forthright and transparent conversations before the book even came out. And again, I didn't have her edit. It wasn't about permission either, by the way. It was more just, here is what I am experiencing, here is what I am publishing, and let's talk.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So with these 2 minutes left, Christina, is there one last quick question that we can get in under the wire for Victoria?
Sure. We have a lot of questions about people don't know how to start writing about their grief. So Victoria, do you have any prompts that maybe you use with your students that you could share with the group on how to get started?
Oh, just use one prompt now because we have 1 minute left. One prompt.
Yeah, I mean, something that I like to do is just jot down before I start writing, or tell students to jot down maybe from any book, like I have the Norton Anthology of American Literature in front of me. I have W.S. Merwin's The Vixen. I have books everywhere, and just write down a word library before you start writing, and give yourself the task, write down 30 words that just are interesting to you. They could be really boring, like plunge. Actually, plunge is a cool word. And then carry, I'm just looking at magnolia, and just write down a small little dictionary of words for something that you're going to write. And then when you start writing, give yourself a task that you have to include every single word that you just wrote down. So if you're a new writer, you might want to give yourself 10 words. If you're like more experienced and you're writing something longer, you can give yourself a bigger dictionary, and then you don't even have to write them down. I mean, you could just leave entire books open on your desk and just look for a word that interests you. And that kind of, for that moment, will get you out of your own mind and get you out of the path that you were planning to take. And you might take a left turn because you wanted to use the word plunge, and you might end up in a pool or in the ocean, which then opens up other possibilities for figurative language, metaphors, images, things like that.
I love that. And what I will say as a wrap up, there's no reason why we collectively could not continue this conversation with our prompt words online. So I encourage you to do that with Victoria, or for Grief, or for me. Let's just keep the conversation going. I love it. Thank you, Reimagine. Thank you for Grief. And of course, my deepest gratitude to Victoria Chang. Thank you so much for being with us today. And I'm just really grateful for your time.
Thanks for all the great questions and thanks for coming.
Bye, everybody.